Hello everyone, I am here to present to you a recap, if you will, on my paper about the history of Alaska Native education. And I really learned a lot writing this paper, and I learned a lot about the history of the educational practices in Alaska Native cultures and how that history has affected contemporary practices and culture identity. So despite holding the highest percentage of Alaska Natives or American Indian population in the United States, there's really very little written about education in a group setting, like very, very, very early on. And before Westernization, education was sort of focused more on the individual family and the community educational experiences and perspectives. What was deemed an educational experience varied from community to community in addition to what was, deemed useful, Alaska Native communities are spread around many diverse parts of Alaska, and they all have unique landscapes and resources, and so what everyone deems important, of course, is going to be, looked at differently. But the one thing that they all had in common is they viewed education as something that can be tied to their community, their values, and their interrelationships with the human, natural, and spiritual worlds. In fact, in interviews conducted with, Koyuka and Athabaskan, it was found that the traditional stories she was told as a child really served as the foundation as her education, and, helped her form her beliefs and, her values to get her through life. And honestly, true to the idea that the Western ideologies took over any sort of system that the Alaska Natives may have had, records of any system of education didn't really begin until a more Western approach was forced upon them. So really, that being said, Westernization happened as early as before 1867, so it's possible that nobody recorded it because it wasn't really thought to be recorded. But Westernization began when Russian fur traders forced themselves into villages, killing the Alaska Natives and taking others hostage. Schools were opened under the guise of providing technical training, but really they were using the natives for free labor and for their own, benefit. The Russians really had no intention of educating Alaska Natives for goodwill, but rather their own selfish benefit of civilizing them. After the purchase of Alaska in 1867, control of the Alaska Native education system kind of switched from American control, but there were a few Russian companies still kind of hanging around. And while the control did switch from Russian to American, the end goal of the education system was the same. Missionaries from different religions formed schools with the intention of Westernizing or Christianizing the Alaskan Natives. The federal government didn't really give much funding to the education system, and those funds kind of were set aside for Indian tribes not otherwise provided for, weren't given to any tribes in Alaska, as they were seen as an uncivilized tribe and not really dependent on, or not a dependent, civilized Indian community. The schools did finally receive funding, however, in 1885, and this was under the Bureau of Education. But unfortunately, the director of the Bureau of Education was a Presbyterian minister, so the schools continued to be run with a Christian overtone. Similar to with the Russians, the goal of the schools was to reclaim the natives from improvident habits and in transforming them into ambitious and self-helpful citizens. Christianity was seen as a tool in influencing Alaska Natives to abandon their old customs. So similar to the Russians, they kind of just wanted to, educate these people for their own benefit and not really, in the Alaska Natives' best interest. Throughout this time, white-dominated local and newly established boarding schools were run with a strict English-only policy, and those developing the curriculum for those schools were abided by those same principles. Alaska Natives and American Indians were seen as savages and immediately were sent to boarding schools in an attempt to civilize them in a timely manner. Schools were English-speaking only and had established codes of behavior that included banning students from wearing any sort of traditional clothing items and enforcing rigorous bodily inspections to ensure hygiene. So this included things like cutting their hair, forcing them to shower, inspecting their body on the daily, just really invasive, impersonal things that just continuously stripped their culture away from them. As the uncivilized schools continued to be funded by the Federal Bureau of Education, they refused to recognize the important differences between the indigenous people in Alaska and those in other states, and even less recognition of the importance between the 20 different Alaska Native groups. Honestly, they were just trying to make everyone seem the same, which, as we know through this class and just through life in general, that is so wrong, because we know how untrue that is. There's just, in the state of Alaska, obviously those 20 different Alaska Native groups are coming from 20 different places, and of course their lifestyles are going to be different. But unfortunately, diverse Native groups were seen as one, and because of this, their conditions and lack of control over their own lives and choices only got worse. It was believed by the borough that education was the best way to assimilate America, and just make everyone one and whole. And as mentioned previously, cultures and beliefs weren't really taken into consideration. It wasn't really until 1928 that it was at least recognized that that there was a need for reform in education. And the recognition kind of inspired the thought that American Indians needed and deserved to be a part at all levels of the education process. So the thought was that both day schools and boarding schools would be revamped, and that the curriculum would be developed with the Indian language and culture as a part of it. It's important to note that at the time, only 80% of the only 40% of all American Indian and Alaskans attending school were attending boarding schools, and even then, they weren't getting instruction past the 8th grade. So the need for the education reform pushed into action the Indian Reorganization and the Alaska Reorganization Acts. The IRA provided for political self-government and economic self-determination by allowing the tribes to organize and incorporate, and the ARA fixed some of the problems of the IRA and gave way to the establishment of the village governments. And even though the thought was there, nothing really changed despite the passing of these acts and a few acts afterwards. People had the thought there, but nothing really went into action. Even in 1950, almost 100 years after the education system was taken over, 1,800 children still had no access to any form of education. And as mentioned previously, those that were lucky enough to attend school still didn't get a chance to attend high school unless they wanted to attend a boarding school, which of course still, required those abysmal conditions that we had mentioned previously. And again, with the influence of both World War II and the Cold War, once again, a sense of unity and conformity was being pushed, and no one wanted it to change. They just wanted everyone to seem the same, be the same, and sort of assimilate into one. When Alaska did gain statehood in 1959, there was hope, but once again, nothing really changed. Attempts were made to provide funding, but that was never really provide funding and change, but that never really materialized. So that being said, once the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was established, the state began to pay attention to the unique educational needs and interests of Alaska Native people in rural areas. And once again, though, unfortunately, the thought was there, but the planning didn't go so well. Chaos sort of ensued, and there was no room for these 8th graders that could theoretically go to high school now. Because of this, the regional education attendance areas was established, which gave the Alaska Natives the ability to have a say in the policy creation for budgets, hiring, curriculum development, and assessment. They also had the power to design their schooling policies and practices in ways that are appropriate for the particular region and for the cultural and linguistic group of people that it serves. And while this was still a huge step forward, there were still holes in the plan. There were still not secondary schools, and high schoolers were being sent to the schools in the lower 48, again, taking them away from their home and their heritage and throwing them into the unknown. So they didn't really solve any of the problem of taking away the culture. But however, though, unlike the past, legislation was created and passed and something was done. Luckily, high schools were developed in every community that had an elementary school, and things were finally rolling in favor of the Alaska Natives. Conflict, unfortunately, of course, though, did continue well into the 90s, including a discrimination case that was brought to the Supreme Court and legislation that negatively affected the Alaska Native villages. Several initiatives were passed, and because of this, presently, for the first time in the history of schooling in Alaska, Native people are defining education on their own terms. In present day, there are 3 main areas where Alaska Natives attend school: village schools, rural regional center, and road system marine highway schools, so schools that you can access from, rural roads and the marine highway, and then urban schools. And while there have been some positive changes to the system, it still wasn't perfect. While the beginning of the Alaska Native education system was not so great, present day and the future is looking hopeful. Educators are taking steps to ensure that teachers understand the dynamics of how children are socialized both into their home culture and into the school culture. and teachers, are needing to be able to get students to think about culture and how it shapes their lives. And that really hits home close to Alaska, because now teachers in Alaska are required to take classes on the history and current lives of Alaska Natives to sort of give us a better idea of, the different cultures and, what to expect. And teachers can help make classroom activities, by reinforcing the child raising patterns of the Native children's extended families. So it's really important to not just shut that out and make everything the same for everyone. We always, push differentiated education. It's important to do that, in cultures as well. Language revitalization has been a huge part of the revamp of the Alaskan education system. My friend Kelsey Hill taught actually in the Toksook Bay for 3 years, and during her time in the village, she noted that tradition and language revitalization are a huge part of their school. In her years there, she picked up on and was patiently taught several Native phrases and words. She used these expressions in everyday conversation and teaching, as did her students. The effect was so strong on her that she had a hard time letting these practices go when she came to teach at the more urbanized school she's at now. So I remember the first couple of days of school, she had a really hard time not using those Native phrases, and finally she stopped fighting it, and she just ended up teaching her class those Native phrases, and she's still using them now. So I think that's really cool. Another great example of culture revitalization, and honestly really a huge reason why Kelsey had the experience she did, was taught through the effort of a woman named Josephine Bourdon. And according to Rizga's article that I read, Bourdon attended school in the time of Westernization and oppression. And as noted in the article, the emphasis was placed on, learning how to read, write, compute, and pass tests in English, always, always, always in English. And due to this, quote-unquote legacy of an education system, Bourdon was one of only about 3,000 out of 13,500 Inupiat people who could speak fluent Inupiaq. And honestly, as we know, speaking fluent languages is a pillar to preserving the culture as a whole. Despite this, she still feels like she was given a traditional Inupiaq education through the efforts of her local elders and her family. She is now a retired educator herself, and while she was teaching, she attempted to incorporate Native knowledge into a more Western model of education. For example, when students studied local fish, she invited a community elder to her classroom to teach students how to split and clean the fish using a traditional, using the ulu. We all know what an ulu is. And then students were also taught science and math through the process of processing that fish. So she really used real-life traditional experiences to teach, more westernized concepts. She sort of combined the best of both worlds, and I thought that was really cool. And she notes that the new lessons erase the distance between the abstract ideas in the textbook nature and the community life. And honestly, as evidence, I know I went through this very quickly, but as evidenced, the history of Alaska Native education is an incredibly fascinating and complicated subject. It's been through a literal it's been through a literal lifetime of oppression and westernization attempts. Despite those unfortunate circumstances, it is so uplifting and inspiring to see the efforts of culture revitalization in Alaska Native communities, and I can only hope that it increasingly continues in years to come. I know I'm way over my presentation time, but I had a lot of, fun, if you will, researching this topic. I learned a lot. I'm really inspired, to incorporate more, cultural practices into my classroom. And like I said, I'm excited to see that, or I'm hoping to see that the revitalization continues in years to come. That's all I got for right now. I hope you guys learned something, and I will be signing off now.